Hello and welcome to Homicide Hobbies. I'm Andy,
And I'm Claire.
and we're here to talk about some of the disturbing things that go on in the world, past and present. We feel like not knowing doesn't mean the crazy doesn't exist.
So we're going to scar you with the knowing.
Enjoy. So, what are we talking about today, Claire?
Today, we're going to discuss Llyod Hunter. Our time period is 1950, and our location will be Tornado Alley, or the Hawkeye State, or the home of the sour cream raisin pie, the state of Iowa.
Interesting.
Yeah, also interesting, if you're looking for the world's largest wooden nickel, they have that too. Not sure why you'd need a giant wooden nickel, but put that in your straw cap. Not to get distracted before we get started anywhere, but I feel like it's the ideal spot to get distracted before we get into the middle of anything. If you're curious how many wooden nickels are out there and just how many qualify as large, I did at least. It's 16 feet and 4,000 pounds.
Holy shit.
Right.
Why? What?
I don't know.
Why?
It was built in 2006 by a feller that was protesting the widening of the highway. So he took it upon himself to build that giant wooden nickel and then informed Texas that their nickel was too small to be the world's largest, measuring in at 13 feet. It took him a whopping 6 months to build that wooden nickel. But anyway, we're going to be in Iowa today.
That's an interesting way to protest.
I don't like.
Is that who this case is on? Because that feller's got some issues.
It sure isn't, Andrea, because I said we'd be in the 1950s and he built that wooden nickel in 2006. I just thought a little bit of Iowa facts for you.
That's definitely an interesting one.
Yeah, I haven't thought of anything that I didn't agree with. I didn't go, you know what's going to solve this argument, this dispute here? I'm going to go build a wooden nickel. That'll teach him.
It sure will. I'm going to protest these here highways being widened and go fight with Texas and tell them their wooden nickel is too small.
I did laugh at that because anybody's like, haha, ours is 3 feet bigger. And I feel like since he did do that, they didn't widen the highway right there because now it's like the world's largest nickel, which is still a weird
weird flex.
So if anyone's curious why that highway now goes circular or like a little arch to it, you can thank the wooden nickel.
I guess that's one way to prevent them from putting a highway through your property. Just build you the biggest nickel ever.
But I am surprised that you had no comments on the sour cream raisin pie.
I made a face, if that makes you feel better.
It doesn't, because I didn't see your face, nor anyone listening to this saw your face. You didn't make a...
My mother-in-law makes some dessert. I don't remember what it is, but she put sour cream in it. I think it was a frosting. The kids liked it. I didn't eat it because I don't like sweets, but...
Or sours.
Just seemed like a weird combination for me. But I'm not judging because I haven't had it, so I wasn't going to comment on their signature dish, no matter how strange it sounds.
Well, cheesecake has sour cream in it. I've never had a cheesecake that had raisins in it, and this isn't a cheesecake, it's a sour cream raisin pie. So, it's a head scratcher.
Sounds weird. Yeah.
Anyway,
sounds like it was an accident.
What are those? Raisins? Why? Why not? Touche.
I feel like somebody added the sour cream by accident as well.
I said whipped cream. Anyway, I just picture people eating tubs of sour cream with raisins in it and staring at a wooden nickel.
So it's real boring in Iowa.
So we're going to get back to talking about Llyod. He was born June 14th, 1908. He had 11 siblings, 9 sisters. He was the 4th oldest.
Yikes.
Now, he wouldn't obviously be drafted in the First World War because he was all of 9 years old. But this feller managed to live through the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and obviously he grew up during World War I. So definitely a feller that knows struggles, hardships, I also figure he knows how to survive and prevail all the things, so I'm picturing a scrappy dude. Now, the World War II draft would happen when he's 32 in 1940. Now, there were a number of American men who did not get drafted in World War II. Now, the ones who, because you had to, you know how you had to register for the draft and all that, and then it's just like if you didn't meet the criteria, then you weren't fit for duty.
Right.
Those they classified them as 4F, or that's what the draft board would declare them as, which meant that they were either not physically or mentally fit for military service. Now, this could also classify if they had physical or mental impairments, and they were also the men who there were also men who classified as conscientious objectors. Those were the people who were religious or moral reasons who didn't want to partake in the war. Now, anybody who fell into those categories were given the option of performing like an alternative service to support the war efforts, but in a civilian defense industry or non-combative roles. Now, another group of men who did not get drafted were those who were classified as essential to the war effort, but not necessarily in the military. Now, those were men who were working in critical industries like farming and manufacturing that were necessary to support the war effort. Now, they weren't typically drafted until later in the war when we got desperate for people. And then you had the people who would avoid the draft through obtaining deferments for education or family reasons, or by bribing draft officials. Naturally, those aren't legal ways. Lloyd was a coal truck driver, and I'm thinking it's possible he was considered one of the essential people, because, them women folk can't drive the big vehicle. But I think it's also possible he was considered mentally impaired. More on that later on, but just so you know, he never served in the military. Again, obviously he was 9 during World War I, but World War II, he was in his 30s, so I was just like, how did he get out of that?
Maybe he wasn't physically capable?
I don't know. But so, again, he wasn't in there. But anyway, I've just figured if he was a coal truck driver and doing all that, maybe he was one of those men that you don't really hear as much about doing the things here. Anyway, he would get married in July 1947 to Maxine Watson and have a daughter born in 1948 that they would name Margaret Rose. Now, our story is really going to center apart one particular day in this feller's life, and that day would be on September 9th, 1950, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. 42-year-old Llyod Hunter was home with his family, his young wife of 22 years old, and his young daughter, who was 2 years old. Their home was one that they subleased, which belonged to Mr. William Hughes, who was an 84-year-old man who lived in the rear part of the small White House. Lloyd and Mr. Hughes did not have a good relationship. They quarreled almost all of the time over the 3 years that they lived in that home. That morning, 84-year-old Mr. Hughes and the neighbor across the street, 81-year-old William Messner, were going to put up a mailbox on the front of the house that he shared with the Hunter family. So there was a mailbox already on the home, but it had the Hunter's family name on it. So Mr. Hughes wanted to put up a second one that had his name on it, because one of the arguments that they would have, one of the many arguments they would have, is over either one of them touching each other's mail.
Makes sense, though. I would find it super annoying if I shared a mailbox with somebody and let's just say they collected all the mail and then it took me forever to get my actual mail from them. So right. I get it.
So I got it too. I also did the whole, well, if Mr. Hughes owns the house and subleases them, I'd also be a little irritated that they put their name on the mailbox. They're not the only ones who live here. But according to Lloyd, he would go out the front door to see what was going on because he saw them, 2 men coming from around the side of the house, and wanted to know what they were doing. Mr. Hughes apparently told him to shut your fucking mouth or I'll get you. Now Lloyd called Mr. Hughes a vile name back and gave him a kick. Now Lloyd went back into the house, then grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun, came back out, aimed it at Mr. Hughes, asking again what they were doing. Mr. Hughes called him another name and said that Lloyd had caused him enough trouble all this time when Lloyd snapped the trigger of the gun, but it didn't go off. The neighbor from across the street that's there goes, "Whoa, whoa, go easy with that gun." Lloyd, standing only 4 to 5 feet from Mr. Hughes, pulls the trigger for a second time and the gun went off, blowing off the lower part of Mr. Hughes' face. He
Oh my
staggers
gosh.
backwards. He staggers backwards a few steps, falls to the ground dead. The mailbox laying not far from his body and his cane falling underneath him. Now, Mr. Messner's story was a little different. He would state that Lloyd did not come out to ask what they were doing, but when he came out of the house, he gave Mr. Hughes a kick in the ribs. Mr. Hughes had
What?
been staying.
He
Right.
like did what? A spin kick kind of deal? How to kick him in the ribs?
I'm telling you. So Mr. Hughes had been standing on the ground by the first step on the porch that had been about, because he was about to show Mr. Messner where they were going to hang the mailbox. When Lloyd walked out of the house, he's coming out of the front door. So if you picture one of those, like, a fucking porch, Andrew, with steps, Mr.
So he's
Hughes
on a
is on the
step, so he's
ground.
higher up.
Right. So his foot is more on the rib section. Now, I find it a little weird that you just walk out there and kick somebody. So I don't know if this is a case of who's telling the truth.
Is it possible the neighbor was hard of hearing
He's
and
81,
didn't?
so I would say it's definitely a possibility.
So maybe he didn't hear any of the arguing that took place at first.
Because it does seem weird for somebody to wander outside and kick somebody in the ribs.
That's so fucked up.
Yeah. But he said after they had their words, Lloyd went in and got the gun and came out, tried to shoot Mr. Hughes, and that was when he told Lloyd to take it easy with the gun. Now, after the shooting, Lloyd went calmly back inside where he sat on the sofa with his wife until officers came. The gun was near the stove, closer to the door of the house. Now, another eyewitness was 9-year-old Joan Hatteraff, who was across the street taking care of a baby when she saw Lloyd fire the shot and went running across the street to see if Mr. Hughes was okay. When she saw he had been shot, she then went running home to her mom and dad. Which, by the way, not only was I was like, this sounds horrible for this 9-year-old girl to see, but I thought she was watching a baby. She just left that kid in the front yard.
Well, first of all, a 9-year-old watching a baby? That sounds dangerous. Number two, she was being a busybody because let's face it, she can't render aid in any way, shape, or form to an elderly man. So she just ran over to see what happened, ditched the baby, which I stand by comment number one of a 9-year-old shouldn't be watching a baby. But when she ran home, what did she do with the baby that she already abandoned?
She said, fuck that kid. I don't care how much I'm being paid for babysitting.
I got some juicy gossip from Ma. She's going to really appreciate this.
I wasn't sure if it was a case of, I would hope a 9-year-old doesn't know what a gun sounds like when it goes off, and she just saw him fall to the ground. So I don't know if she thought she was going to run over and help the old man up. Like maybe he fell off of the porch. But still, she just ditched however old that kid was, and he's just sitting in the front yard. It's probably a case later that he got kidnapped and abducted, and no one knows what happened to that kid. Joan was supposed to watch him.
It's fucked up.
But I was like, how horrible. Anyway, so Lloyd would admit to officers that he shot Mr. Hughes and even go as far as to tell several witnesses that he had had trouble with Mr. Hughes.
It don't mean you get to shoot him.
I'm going to give you a list of what he said, like their troubles were. He would steal vegetables from their garden, gave him a whole heap of trouble when he wanted to hang up a clothesline. Lloyd had apparently put up a clothesline, and then Mr. Hughes proceeded to tear it down, which made them argue about that. Now, that happened a few days prior, which is why I feel like when Mr. Hughes went to put up a mailbox, Lloyd was pissed because it's one of those, even though it might be Mr. Hughes' house, Lloyd's seeing it as, it's basically a constant pissing match between the two. Lloyd tried to put up a clothesline that would help, obviously, do the laundering in. But he's going to put up a mailbox, he's going to take it down. So it was like they're just,
I hate to say,
oil and water is what these two were.
Well, I hate to say it though, but if you're a renter, unfortunately, your landlord owns the house, and if they're also living there, what they say goes. You don't like it, move.
Now, the vegetable things, or him stealing vegetables from the garden, part of me kind of laughed at first because I was just like, he's an 84-year-old man. How much could he possibly eat? But then I was also considering he grew up during the Great Depression and World War One. This is after like the end of World War II, the Dust Bowl, all that stuff. he went through a lot, so they know what it's like to not have food. So then I was like, you know what? I can see that being an arguing point of he's taking food off of their table, and it may be a struggle to feed his little family.
No, I also question, is it possible it's a rabbit or deer or some kind of critter? And he's like,
Yeah,
I knew there were tomatoes growing here on this bush last night. And then in the morning, they're gone. Or is he actually witnessing him taking the vegetables?
it's possible he had a pest problem, and it was easier just to blame Mr. Hughes. Just like, I mean, again, that they had issues, so I feel like it was easier for him to make up in his brain that the guy that he doesn't like is always doing all the things just to bother him, like taking down his clothesline. Now, now, mind you, that clothesline was a few days prior to the mailbox issue that led to Mr. Hughes' death. But his final grievance, and I'm curious of your reaction, is that Mr. Hughes had made several advances on his wife.
What?
I,
He's
I
81.
four,
She's in her
84. The
20s.
neighbor was 81, but I was like, I would, I I read that and did like a. He is concerned that an 84-year-old man is going to steal his wife. I guess it could happen, but I don't know what kind of advances. Maybe he was being pervy. Maybe he was trying to catch her in the shower kind of thing. Maybe it was like a. It's not like he's just doing
Maybe he
wiggly
freed his willy
eyebrows.
in front of her.
Well, maybe he was doing wiggly eyebrows. That's what I would have assumed he was doing, and maybe that wasn't what he was doing.
Maybe he was winking at her, but he really wasn't winking.
Because then I was like, maybe if he was, rather than saying he was making passes at his wife, that if he was being a pervy old man, I could see where that would also make it difficult to live there. Of like, his wife's got to be there all day with him.
That's an interesting grievance to have.
Right, I feel like the police officers kind of looked at each other. It's an old man that walks with a cane.
Sorry.
Now,
It's not funny.
he would tell police officers that he had gone to authorities about the issues he was having with his landlord, but it went nowhere, resulted in nothing. And I would imagine if Mr. Hughes was aware of him trying to go tattling, that only added to the hostilities in that household.
I mean, makes sense.
Now, he would even run his mouth to his employer about his troubles, which I feel like that's just a man venting to anybody who wants to listen, whether there was somebody in the room or not, wouldn't have mattered any. He still would have vented. But he would tell his employer that he might have to shoot Mr. Hughes because if he wasn't going to be entitled to any justice, well, by golly, he was going to get it for himself.
He sounds like an entitled little prick. You're renting somebody else's house. If you don't like it, move.
Now, at no time did Lloyd deny his actions or offer any explanation beyond he had troubles with Mr. Hughes, so he got his gun and went out and popped him. His words, by the way. Now, Lloyd was charged with first-degree murder, which he attempted to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, because his
What?
attempt... I know. Because his attempt at an insanity plea, Lloyd would be checked out for mental conditions at the psychopathy hospital at the State University of Iowa. Now, testimony would be entered that after several tests, Lloyd was determined to have an IQ of 68, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is borderline to being considered mentally defective. And some doctors would testify that if you have that threshold or margin of error for that, is whether or not he's considered mentally handicapped. So he could have tested high. I don't know. It's just he's on the borderline for normal and or mildly handicapped. 50 to 70 is that range for mildly mentally handicapped. 35 to 50 is moderate, 20 to 35 is severe, less than 20 is profoundly mentally handicapped, and most likely you're in some sort of mental hospital because you're drooly. But Dr. Miller would say that considering all the circumstances, especially that Lloyd was frustrated, and as he said, he blew his top and acted in an intense rage. Now, Lloyd would not take to defend his actions. Later on, I think when he realized that first-degree murder carried the option of a death penalty, he decides to retract that not guilty plea and plead guilty to second-degree murder instead, which carried a sentence of 10 years to life. he would end up sentenced to life in prison. Now, Llyod would attempt to appeal his sentencing, citing that the court imposed a sentence of life imprisonment. That whole thing was excessive. But the court would come back with, so you've got all the elements here to carry on with a first-degree murder charge, including malice and premeditation, as well as the intent to kill without justification. So we're going to say no, just be glad you fucking don't die. I paraphrased that a little. But his parents would die while he's in jail in 1958 and 59. Now, Llyod would die in prison November 1973 at 63 years old. Now, his wife and daughter, I couldn't figure out why they moved to Arizona, but that's where they move, and I tried real hard. I didn't find any family or anything that they had in Arizona, so I don't know if it was just a case of they wanted a new start and get away from all of that. But Maxine, his wife, would go back to her maiden name. I didn't see where she ever got remarried. But when she does die in 2011, she is brought back and buried in Iowa. I know. I was like, shit.
Well, but you know what, though? She was really young when he married her. He was in his 30s, and she was 22.
Andrea, her daughter dies in 2013.
Holy moly.
She
lived she saw a lot of shit in her life, you know that?
She sure did. Now, both of them were buried in Iowa, but I thought that case was a puzzler. Yeah, well, that lady in particular, she also lived through the Korean War, because that started the year the shooting took place with Mr. Hughes. But when I read this one, this is another think piece for you, because I had mixed feelings about it. Not saying that if you have I'm not saying that if you have grievances with somebody, you can shoot them, not at all. However, it does make me curious if it happened nowadays, if you're on the cusp of basically being mildly mentally handicapped. I don't know that he would have gotten life in jail. I think they probably would have treated, or it's possible by that point there wasn't a diagnosis for whatever he may or may not have had.
I think he'd still get life. Whether it be in a mental hospital or whatever. It sounds like they were going back and forth. He made the comment already about possibly having to shoot his neighbor, which means he'd already thought it through. And rather than try to find a new place to live, he already made peace with the fact that that was something he might have to do one day. So no, he's 100%.
I'm not saying he wasn't guilty. I think it's one of those, it'd be interesting to know how justice would be carried out now.
I know it's kind of the opposite, but I remember when COVID first started, reading an article about I think it was 3 kids. You can't quote me on any of the information I'm about to tell you, because it was a while ago, and we've already established we got leaky brain holes. So
then how do we know this is how you're remembering it?
It was a screwed up article, because the article said, basically, don't fuck with old people. And I was like, what? So I was reading it, and I think the guy was like 83, and he had 3 tenants that were in their 20s, and it was during COVID. They were getting money from the government, but not paying their rent. But he was still having to pay his mortgage. And, you know, everybody knows how hard COVID was at the time when we were all closed in. And even though he's still paying his bills, they're sitting there doing drugs. And he lived, I think it was like a duplex situation. So he could see their comings and goings, and like they're drinking and smoking weed and just having the time of their lives. And he's struggling to make ends meet because he's having to cover their bills as well. So he went and told them they had to go, but because there was that whole no eviction thing going on, he went and shot all 3 of them and killed them. When they asked him why he did it, he's like, what do I have to lose? I'm 84 years old. The bank's about to take my house because they're not paying their bills. What do I have to lose at this point? The police wouldn't help me. The courts won't help me. What the hell do I have to lose? And like the article ended with a whole, don't fuck with old. His wife had died like a decade prior. None of his family lived nearby. What did he have to lose? He just had enough. But I realize that's kind of the reverse of the situation. But
well, it's kind of relevant in the sense of if somebody feels like all the avenues that they tried to go down aren't helping, and maybe they couldn't afford to move into another place. Maybe whatever Mr. Hughes was charging was all that they could afford, and everywhere else available was too much. So it's like here he is.
Maybe there just was nothing.
he goes, well, yeah, he goes to work and he's got to deal with maybe he was being pervy towards his wife and he's got to hear about it. And then when he comes home and there's more vegetables missing, that it's just the boiling point's going higher and higher. And I feel like when people get to that point, they're not thinking clearly anyway. But
Yeah.
I was thinking of it in terms of what would you do if your husband, like just he comes calmly back inside, just shot the landlord. You what? Like they've been
Yeah.
married 2 years. Well, really 3. But I can't even imagine just sitting there being like, you what?
No, I'd be sitting there just doing some blinking. I wouldn't be sitting calmly on the couch. I can tell you that.
Well, what would you have been doing? Moving the body?
No, I would have been pacing, most likely, doing, why would you do that? What is wrong with you? Freaking out kind of situation. I wouldn't have just sat there twiddling my thumbs like, let's wait for the police to show up. I
I don't
probably
know.
would have done.
I don't know. I could see it either way.
Maybe she's numb and shock and sitting. Her whole life just got turned upside down, realistically.
Yeah. I could see her sit down and be like,
In a zombie like state in shock.
yeah, she's about to be
What the heck am I going to
responsible
do?
for, right, responsible for her 2-year-old daughter.
I just became a
Anyway,
single parent.
yeah,
Well, the fact
I
that he pulled the
know.
trigger twice, he knew what he was doing.
Yeah. Well, that was the other side of that one. Is just he doesn't really give himself wiggle room. He had a lot of witnesses, and the fact that his employer was like, yeah, he mentioned needing to shoot him. But then I feel like that also. Now that's why I brought up the draft thing, because I feel like if he possibly, and I couldn't find this one because evidently there isn't a list, or I don't know where to find said list of people who weren't fit to be drafted. If he was too mentally handicapped to serve in the military, would that not have been something as like a tool in his defense pocket of he's already got something that said he was defective, he can't go to war.
Unless you're right, and his defectiveness was that he had a job of importance.
Yeah. But again, he was on the cusp of mild mentally defective to normal, which again, lower IQ if you've got the brain of a younger person, then your decision making and processing and use of your logic, all things come into play. And if you're blind with rage, you're not in a clear part of decision making.
I feel like there's a lot of men folk and women folk who have full capabilities of the brain hose, but when they're in a blind rage, they're not thinking clearly. So I don't even give that as a free pass.
Again, I'm not saying it's a free pass to go shoot your landlord for your grievances. I was just saying I thought it was interesting case.
It's definitely a thinker.
You're gonna have to mull it over a little bit. I know it wasn't
Yeah.
riveting. Nobody was collecting eyeballs or pubes, so I know it didn't have your interest. I just thought it was interesting because I feel like we do tackle the serial killers and they've got all these issues, but he's a feller who basically just lost his cool. He made a mistake. He never, I mean, it's a huge mistake, but he was not a delinquent. He wasn't bad. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
the repercussions of one horrible decision basically ruined his entire family.
I wonder if he was a hothead to begin with, though. It sounds like he was. And maybe his wife was like, not surprised.
Well, so part of me that when I started researching the military aspect, there were a lot of communities during like the draft and all that. If you were a feller who did not serve in the war and try to do your part to protect freedom and all that the US stood for, you were kind of looked down upon. Now, mind you, they also used that classification to keep homosexuals out of the military. So there was stigma to that. And honestly, when I was researching it, I didn't quite realize how much the people who didn't get drafted or do their part, how much some people would trash them and their life became hard, or they were seen as like less than. So I don't know if maybe Mr. Hughes was a former military kind of thing. and his neighbor was too. And maybe if that was an aspect of he was always getting picked on too. And maybe he did want to go into the military, but he was told he couldn't. The lengths of what kind of mental fuck uppery the situation developed into. It also makes me think of those, what's that crime show where it's like when your neighbor's bad, or the murderer next door. What is it? You know that it's on IDTV.
I don't know.
It's an entire show about confrontations with neighbors and when it goes bad and becomes murderous because people end up, it's almost like road rage.
All the more reason to try not to have a neighbor.
That was not the point of this, but I'm just saying it's one of those, really, there needs to be another option if you're feeling yourself go ragey. But I feel like people get ragey because they feel like they ran out of options.
Like a caged animal or a cornered animal.
A caged animal.
Well,
right?
If you catch an animal in a cage, they're going to be not so friendly. We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Homicide Hobbies. If we made you laugh, if we made you cry, or if we mind-fucked you for the day, then we thank you for listening. Please write a review on whatever you're listening to us on. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your coworkers. We're freaking awesome. And join us next week for another episode of Homicide Hobbies. I'm Andy.
And I'm Claire.
That's all we've got.